Welcome, everyone. I'm Joe Galvin, Chief Research Officer here at Vistage. I'm happy to host the latest webinar in our Peak Performer webinar series. This series is designed to support your leadership climb by bringing the most trusted experts to the Vistage community. Experts who provide exceptional insight and best practices to help you navigate new challenges and possibilities. As you well know, CEOs face numerous decisions to make that impact their families, their companies, and communities. To best illustrate this, we've created the Vistage Decision Model, a research-based framework that business leaders can use to categorize what decisions they should be focused on to optimize their business and enhance their leadership climb. At the center is you, the leader, the attributes, the behaviors, the characteristics you demonstrate and model from successful leaders. This is something that you show up with every day. The next layer is leadership, the processes, strategies, and tactics of leadership. And the outer layer are the business optimization categories. The decision model was created through the input of over 240 Vistage chairs in 14 cities, seeking to create a common language to describe the issues, topics, and decisions that are most important to you, the Vistage community. Which leads us to where we are today. Coming into 2023, there are a series of critical trends that long-term Vistage member and speaker Marc Emmer has identified and researched. He uniquely illuminates the key economic, workplace, technology, and ecological social trends for 2023. And in most important ways, you can leverage these trends for a competitive advantage. Marc is president of Optimize Inc., a management consulting firm based in Los Angeles. He's an 18-year member and is recognized throughout North America as an author, speaker, and expert on strategy and strategic planning. Marc has written 2 books and is a frequent contributor to Forbes and Inc.com. His annual trend series, which you can find on the Research Center, is among the most consumed content every year. Marc, it is such a pleasure to have you with us today. I can't wait to hear your insights. Your work is so valued in our community. Welcome, my friend.
Thank you, Joe. And a pleasant good morning or afternoon to all of you, wherever you might be. You know, it's been my pleasure to work with over 100 Vistage members on corporate strategy. And I would make the following observation of entrepreneurs. We hate uncertainty. And we don't have any certainty on the menu today. But what I would love to do is offer some facts that are already in evidence so that we'll have more clarity as we plan our strategies for 2023 and beyond. And I'd like to start with economic trends because I know they're top of mind for all of our members. And, you know, we seem to be consumed with this daily onslaught of business news about the Fed and the impact it'll have on inflation. And if we want to understand the behavior of the Federal Reserve, we also have to understand their mistakes of the past. So back in the 70s, they garnered a lot of criticism for waiting too long and allowing the wage spiral and stagnation to infiltrate the US economy. And one of the important things that we learned during that time is that the fear of inflation is actually worse than inflation itself. Because when consumers think that prices are going to be higher in the future, they overconsume, and then that's when our economy overheats. So what the Fed is trying to do is they're trying to crush the demand side of inflation. Monetary policy is not very effective at controlling supply side type inflation problems. So what they're trying to achieve is known as non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment, which is this kind of theoretical state where interest rates, unemployment, and inflation are in harmony with one another. Now, the good news is we can actually track their progress. This table represents a consensus of all the major economists in the United States. And, you know, we're hearing all of this conversation about a soft landing. What that is looking like is flat growth for the first half of the year. And during that time, the unemployment rate starting to escalate and the consumer price increase starting to decline. But the thing that I think is really interesting on the table is they're not calling for net jobs to decrease until the fourth quarter. So if that is true, what's going to happen is wage inflation is going to be quite persistent and cause a fair amount of problems for our members on the line. So I will come back to that a little bit later. But what I would suggest to you is that if these numbers don't take hold, if by Q2 we don't see inflation more in that 3 or 4%, that's when our economy will really be in trouble, and we will have a deeper recession and even potentially worse stagflation. So this is kind of all the levers that the Fed are trying to pull at the moment. Joe, any comments or questions thus far?
No, Mark, you're on a roll. Keep going.
Right. Okay, great. So I think there's 3 primary shocks that we're all need to be aware of as we're planning our strategy and thinking about risk into the future. There's the geopolitical, commodity and energy prices, and the broader macroeconomic instability and uncertainty ahead of us. On the geopolitical front, you know, the news loves to like fear monger, right? Every night we're seeing bombs in Ukraine, and you know, the threat of a nuclear attack and all of those things. And I'm not trying to minimize them because there's a human toll there. But in terms of the impact on the US economy, we should be much more concerned about China. And I'd say there's 2 potential big risks there. The first is that should they get past all of their COVID problems and open up their border fully, and the Chinese economy starts to heat up, then they will start to suck up all the commodities, and commodity inflation could return. Conversely, if their borders close and we don't have, and keep in mind, China, you know, we really haven't had access to the China economy for the last 3 years. They could actually place a lot of demand on commodities once again. The other thing is that it looks like there's a real estate bubble in China, similar to the US real estate bubble in 2008. In 2021, the investment in Chinese real estate was a value 24 times the real estate value of Manhattan, just to give you a sense of scale. So it looks like that bubble could burst. The other thing is there's quite a few countries that are really struggling right now, seeking relief from the IMF and others, and any of those defaults could spark some kind of global recession. So looking ahead to commodities and energy, there's definitely been a cooling, and particularly in the transportation costs. So the cost to get a container for China is roughly back to its pre-pandemic levels. I'm going to talk a little bit later about an energy transition that's going on a global basis. And we have far fewer commodity shortages, but I think a lot of companies have realized it's really about ensuring they have supply more than controlling the costs. Now, in terms of the broader macroeconomic instability, kind of the headlines is we still have stimulus-fueled consumer demand, and the consumer is very resilient at the moment. US households have $1.5 trillion more cash than they had before the pandemic. About a third of our inflation is energy related. And you know, European banks just don't have the wherewithal to manipulate the economy in Europe like the Fed can do that in the US. So that's a real disadvantage. And you know, we see countries like the UK and Italy that are building a lot of debt that's going to affect their currency and a lot of other things.
Mark, before we jump into workplace trends, I wanted to peel apart a little bit of the economic points that you made. One, you mentioned inflation, and inflation, while it is coming down, it's still well above where it's been, and it still means prices are higher. The result is another round of price increases, both coming to CEOs, and they in turn now have to pass that on. Is there any end in sight to that dynamic? Will we see fewer price increases? Is there a different pricing strategy as inflation continues to come down, hopefully, and how that will impact? And the counter to that is, at the same time, interest rates have been rising. Now, supposedly it's going to be a 1/4 point when it comes up in February, but how do those 2 dynamics play into how this may play out over the course of the year?
Well, I think what a lot of members are doing, and trust me, this has been a constant conversation in the Vistage talks I've delivered in the last 2 years, is a lot of companies are shifting to a more dynamic form of pricing, right? So the reason why dynamic pricing is useful is it resets supply and demand. And people aren't going to like this example because it's painful, but if you want to see that in play, consider surge pricing on a ride share. So it's painful when you think it's going to be $80 to go to the airport and suddenly it's $140. But what happens is that instantly reshuffles supply and demand. So I think a lot of providers are thinking in those terms. We need to more instantaneously and in real time be able to adjust our pricing. And a lot of customers, even B2B customers, are a lot more accepting of that type of thing than they've been in the past.
The other element you mentioned was unemployment, and we just saw the unemployment numbers were at a 40-year low at 3.5%. Yet you said the Fed is trying to raise that number up for reasons that are probably good. How do you see that playing out? Is that something that they can actually squeeze, or will the thirst for employees that we continue to see, 60-some% of our community will be increasing headcount in the year ahead? How do you see that dynamic playing out?
Yes, to both those things. So the Fed had better impact unemployment, or we're going to have a deep recession. However, the other thing you said is very true. I think we're in a war for talent and wages are going to be higher. So matter of fact, why don't we just go there now, Joe? Because that's kind of the next section in the deck. So what we're really seeing is that in April of 21 was around the time that there became more job openings than workers to fill them. And those curves have really not started to return back to normalcy. And my concern about that is I think the narrative within the business community on wage inflation is a little off base. And here is why. I've seen on many Vistage networks banter going on between members about how much, what types of raises they should be giving in 2023. And there are people quoting federal numbers that might show the total wages going up in the order of 5%. But that's the total number of wages. That's not comparing a worker to a worker. So I access ADP data that does exactly that. So they're looking at actual company payrolls. And when an employee leaves and goes to another company, they're tracking that employee and they're comparing their salary in their new position. And according to the ADP data, the wage inflation for people staying in the same job in December was 7.3%. And for people who switched jobs, it was 15%, which is why so many of our employers are feeling so much pain and feeling like things are so competitive. And I would say this pain is pretty well distributed across the economy. So this slice shows by company size, and we see some of the smaller employers are having a hard time keeping pace, but pretty much all employers are needing to be at that 7% Mendoza line if they are going to be competitive in terms of increasing comp. Here it is, the same data by industry. And it's super interesting. We're still seeing a lot of revenge travel. Leisure travel is still very hot. So leisure and hospitality has the highest wage inflation. There are trade and transportation is like your freight and supply chain. It's strong. The one that surprises me on here is construction, because construction is in the midst of their down cycle, yet construction pay is still remaining high. I think that's in part because of the competition in those lower job bands and raising minimum wage and that type of thing. Manufacturing still going strong. Interestingly enough, professional services, which is your attorneys and your CPAs and your consultants, consulting firms are starting to lay people off. You know what they say about consultants, 80% of business people hate consultants, 20% are consultants. That's just
speaking as a consultant yourself.
Right. Now, as we look at the same data by age and gender, certainly the younger workers have much higher wage inflation than older workers, and women slightly more than men. Part of that could be through equality efforts, but I also think that there's some bias in this number because those same industries that tend to employ more female, like leisure and hospitality, are also the ones where the wage rates are going up the fastest. So a lot to think about in terms of wage inflation. The other thing is that separations are much higher than before the pandemic. So the government tracks separations and quits. This is just quits. And there's quite a bit of variance from industry to industry. But what's fascinating is those same industries that I just noted have the highest wage inflation. They are also the ones with the most separations, like leisure and hospitality, which just tells you that we're in an environment where employees feel like they have leverage, and it's really hard for us to hold on to people.
Mark, to insert here is that the quit rate is interesting, because those are people that are moving up. In your chart 2 or 3 charts ago, you showed how people that changed are getting paid much higher than people that stay. And we're social beings, so this weekend we'll be at a social event and you'll hear about, well, yeah, this Mark, he just changed jobs and he made another 20%. How do CEOs reconcile that? Meaning, I have these open headcount I have to fill, but I've got these loyal, hardworking employees. That new information that the new employee makes this much more than I did, that lasts about 7 seconds before everybody knows in the company. How do you deal with that as a leader?
Yeah, you open up a Pandora's box on a bunch of really difficult topics. And what I would say is, obviously there's leadership issues, communication issues within your company that everyone's grappling with. But the other thing is, and people are not going to like hearing this from me, but I think we need to reset our expectations on direct labor. Direct labor costs more. And there's no way out of it. Doesn't matter even if you're a best-in-class employer and you're the best employer branding and you have great retention policies and you treat your people really well, if they can get $7 or $8 more down the street and they're living just above the poverty line, money's going to speak volumes to them. It used to be, before the pandemic, in all the leadership books we read, compensation was the 8th or 9th most important thing. Well, now it's clearly in the top 3. So we just have to have a lens for that.
Right. And you can only compete for so many things based on workplace and culture and boss and all those other factors that are in that list. But there's no question, to acquire talent, you have to pay for it. The downside is, what's the impact on the existing people that are getting the work done for you?
And that's highly problematic. And again, I'm not minimizing those other things, because I think they're critically important. I'm just saying comp is one of the things you have to have right. So a lot of our clients they're doing a formal comp benchmark every single year, sometimes more often, sometimes every quarter. And they're doing that both at the management level and also at the hourly level.
Mark, with the gap between jobs and people seeking jobs, the quit rate and the unemployment rate, it doesn't suggest that's going to moderate anytime soon. Do you see a different trend to that, or do you think we'll continue to be caught up in this competition to acquire and retain talent? And we know that hiring gets headlines, but retention gets the work done. How do you see that playing out?
Yeah, so in one of my earlier slides, I said, I don't think that imbalance is going to change and probably until 2024. So we should be paying attention to that jobs report and doing our salary benchmarking. But that's I'm afraid where we are, that wage inflation is like the long tail of this economic circumstance that we're in.
Well, they call it the Great Resignation, but I think of it as the big upgrade. Right?
Yeah.
Because everybody's got a chance to upgrade, and your data just showed that. So it's a very dynamic trend that's playing out real time with our folks right now, as you know.
Right. All right, so let's switch gears. I'd like to talk a little bit about hybrid work, and in part because I think some of the business narrative on hybrid might not be consistent with what the data is telling us. So first of all, there are deeply varying opinions about the value of hybrid work for employers and employees. So this is a very interesting cut that shows the likelihood that people will want to work remotely based on their age. So what we're finding is that your more tenured older workers, they are more likely to be caring for children or caring for their elders. They are least likely to want to drive into the city. They are less caring about career progression than a 25-year-old would be. So there is a far greater desire to work in a hybrid environment amongst your older workers than there is amongst your younger workers, which may be counterintuitive because it was the younger ones who were doing it before the pandemic. Now, when we ask employers, what are your top reasons for going hybrid? In order, they are health and wellness of their employees, labor productivity, and access to talent. And I'm really intrigued by how consumed people are about labor productivity. So it's super interesting because what some economists did during the course of the pandemic, and I would think this was a real disservice, they reported the times that when labor productivity went down, but during those times, they were comparing with times where labor productivity had spiked in a previous period. You have to remember the labor productivity is a function of unemployment. If unemployment goes up, labor productivity goes up because you have roughly the same output and less employees providing that output. So the real measure, because keep in mind, during the pandemic, we did spike at one point up to 6-7% or higher unemployment rate. So the real measure should be what happened before the pandemic and after the pandemic. So I know that this is going to be an unpopular comment for some people, but compared with before the pandemic, labor productivity is about 5% higher than it was before we went to hybrid. So there is no empirical evidence that hybrid work environments are yielding less productivity. The evidence is actually the reverse of that. The productivity has gone up about 5%. But I would suggest to you it's the wrong lens altogether. What's happened is that 85% of employers believe the shift to hybrid has made it challenging to have confidence that employees are being productive. But their evidence of that is what they see with their eyes. So 54% report, 36% report that they have the visual cues as evidence that their employees being productive, as opposed to 54% before the pandemic. So this gap has created what Microsoft has coined as a productivity theater, where workers feel they must prove their value by leaving crumbs for their managers to illustrate that they're being productive. In other words, they're manufacturing work that doesn't even exist to try to prove to their employers they're being productive. I can't imagine something more unproductive than that. Now let's look at it from the employee's point of view. When asked what percent of employees think they're better off than 2 years ago, 39% say that they have higher job satisfaction compared to 20% who say they have lower job satisfaction. 41% are more happy and 24% are less happy. So the employees are much more happy in a hybrid environment. So if you're in an environment, and of course hybrid does not work in every work environment, we're crystal clear on that. But where it does work, should your measure be productivity if your employees are much happier and you're under tremendous wage pressure? I would suggest to you that that's a trade-off that most employees should be willing to accept, even if the labor productivity was 10% less, which it's not. So I know this is a bit controversial, but I hope to reframe how people are thinking about it.
Well, Mark, you bring up the tension between what leaders want, which is the traditional Monday to Friday, 9 to 5. They want to have people in, they can see you as working, versus workers who really enjoy the flexibility of not having to commute every day and finding that balance of those 2 days. And we've kind of reached a kind of an accepted status quo in each company. This is how it is. How challenging will it be for CEOs to change that and say, hey, instead of 2 days a week, I now want you here 4 days a week? And in turn, how is that going to affect the chart we're looking at here? And more importantly, employee retention. And we've all heard stories about saying, yeah, if I have to go back 5 days a week, I'm gone.
You just illustrated why quits are, well in the 30%. So companies are struggling with what you just said. So here's a particular insight I could offer on solving the problem. Employees are saying they want to be home in the office 3 or 4 days a week. Employees are saying they want to be home 3 or 4 days a week. Employees are saying we want you in the office 3 or 4 days a week. But where the employees are struggling, I do a lot of employee engagement study work with our clients, And one of the insights that I've really garnered is what's frustrating employees is when they feel their employers are bringing them to the office in some kind of random contrived way with no purpose. So if you're going to demand of your team that they be in the office, give them a purpose. On Tuesday, we're doing departmental meetings and we're going over our KPIs. On Wednesdays, we're doing our performance reviews and having our one-to-ones. On Thursdays, we're having our cross-departmental meetings, and orchestrate it all so when then people are in the office, they're productive. The thing that frustrates employees the most is you bring them in the office and they're in a Zoom meeting with people who are outside the office and they're going to want to kill you. So, you have to have a sense of purpose for what you're doing in the office.
I've also heard people get really upset when they come in the office and the boss is not there.
Yes.
Right. So
Right.
it'll help me again understand, apart from an attendance requirement, why I'm doing this. Anyway, go on, Mark.
Right. Oh, no, you're good. Okay. So what's also coming out of this environment is non-traditional retirement. So we know a lot of people retired early, but they retired in a way that's different than before. 14% are working part-time, 17% quit and then re-entered the workforce because they were bored. 25% just keep working, and 44% are more the traditional retirement. So there's more people with a non-traditional retirement than with a traditional retirement. And that's an opportunity to access these knowledge workers, the wisdom workers, the ones that, have that trade craft and all of that tribal knowledge, but maybe you need to access them in a different way. Maybe they are remote, maybe they are part-time, maybe they're a counselor in some way, or they're on an advisory board, but look for a way to leverage this talent.
Mark, is this different than what it was before the pandemic? Has this changed?
Absolutely. There were more people in there was a dream of traditional retirement in the US, and now that dream is gone. People are thinking about it very, very differently. Yeah. Now, the other thing that's super fascinating is there is also this wage arbitrage going on where employers have figured out that if I go to hybrid, I can employ people in less costly geographies. So for dramatic effect, in Rochester, if you hire an IT analyst, you're going to pay them $90 an hour. If you hire them in Kansas City, it's $32 an hour. So there's an important lesson in all this. We all should be moving to Kansas City because arguably they have the best barbecue there.
There's no debate on that. I agree.
Yeah. Well, actually, it's probably as controversial as labor productivity. People will put up a fight on who has the best barbecue. But I do think this is fascinating that companies are starting to reset their footprint. I am not one of these people who thinks that, commercial real estate's going to crash and there's going to be no cities anymore. That's all overstated. But what's clear is we're already seeing these really big companies like Meta and Salesforce. They are dramatically decreasing the footprint of their offices. I have some clients with some very large offices that are, empty, and people are going to be rethinking what their office footprint looks like and their ability to serve people remotely.
So Mark, let's connect. We talked about the dynamics of the workplace and we talked about the economy before. We know that consumers represent 2/3 of total spend, right? Business investment, half of the other third, and government spending. We know government spending's up. We know employment's high. How does this now connect to our commentary earlier about the pending downturn, pending recession economy? If everybody's got jobs, and if they don't have jobs and they get laid off, they can get a job in a very short period of time as compared to 08, 09 when it took 6, 12, 18 months.
I think that during a healthy US economy, the GDP is growing at 3 or 4%. And if it's growing at 0, we all freak out and the world's going to end. Yeah. It's 3%. So, I think a lot of it is, it's emotional, right? So it's what they call animal spirits on the stock market. We trade with our emotions. We think with our emotions. And, the news, they just continue to fuel the flames with all this fear. So I don't think it's that catastrophic. I think there's going to be some tightening that has to happen. And of course, I feel for the unemployed, but right now it's still a very rich job market. And like I said earlier, their consumers got a lot of cash to burn. So that's why, the set of economic conditions seems to have so much staying power.
It's the old Ronald Reagan joke: a recession's when your neighbor loses his job, a depression's when you lose yours.
That's right. Yeah, very good. All right, I'm gonna move on and talk a little bit about technology. So there has been quite the stir in the last couple of months about ChatGPT, which of course is an AI technology. I think there's going to be two big trends in technology in 2023. And one of them is that AI is going to kind of replace routine tasks that we have. Now, the reason that ChatGPT caught so much attention is, it's free and open source. So OpenAI is actually a Microsoft product. So you can set up a free account and you can go play with it. I went in and I typed in, what are some hot items for Valentine's Day? Because I've been married for 32 years. We've got to keep things fresh. But it's very conversational and much deeper than a web search. And it gives you content that you can use. So that's very similar, I would say, to a number of AI tools that are on the market now. So the other big trend I think we're going to see in technology is AI as a service. So I think a lot of your small and medium-sized Vistage member type companies have been concerned that AI was going to be something only available to large competition. But the reality is these products are very, very accessible. Many of them are low-cost subscription products. And I'd say they're particularly useful in marketing. These are all marketing tools as an example. Cynthia is basically your celebrity spokesperson. That person happens to be a fictional AI model, but they're very realistic looking. So in lieu of having a production studio and doing a lot of videos, you can do that within your AI subscription. Jasper, I've been using for a few months as a content creator. You go on and similar like my last slide, you say, please create content on trends within AI, and it will write you a blog post. And it ensures that you're not encumbering on anyone else's intellectual property in the post that it writes. So it's pretty amazing technology. Seamless AI is a scrubber. So say you have 5,000 or 6,000 LinkedIn contacts, but you don't have email addresses. It will go in and search the entire internet and find email addresses for many of those 5,000 people, as well as the rest of their contact information. And the last one is an answer bot. So that's when you see on a web page where it just does the basic customer service functions and answers the questions that you have. So a lot of this movement in AI is helping to reframe our paradigm around information technology. So 6% of companies will spend less money on IT in 23 than they did in 22, but 51% will spend more. And of that group, they're spending on average 21% more. So there's kind of a separation of the haves and have-nots, and some companies who are really investing in technology, but the way they're investing is different. They're supporting the work remote revolution, and they're moving from being focused on hardware to creating software applications that will improve the customer experience. And these AI tools, on one hand, they're kind of risky. They expand your technology debt and your risk because you're putting everything in the hands of AI. But then there's also tools such as cyber that will actually reduce your risk. And the other thing is we're seeing another big trend is the adoption of cobots, which are robots that work side by side with humans. One other observation I'd make about automation, I actually put this in last year's report. One thing that we saw during the pandemic was a lot of your manufacturing companies who are trying to automate, they really struggled because there's two things that you need to automate. You need equipment from Eastern Europe and you need engineers. And those are both things that are in tough supply. So I think the focus in the last 2 years as people tried to cut labor out of the system was maybe your manufacturing automation. A real trend moving forward is going to be more your office automation, such as what you might get through something like a chatbot.
Mark, on the AI topic, we asked this question, it was probably in 2018, 2019. We saw just a few companies were tiptoeing into it. Now you identify these tools that are easy to use, AI as a service. Do you see a broader penetration in the small and mid-sized business community? More importantly, how do people wade into this if they've never engaged with AI before, and their IT team is already challenged to keep up with what they're doing now?
I'd say it's more about the philosophy that they have. So 5 years ago, when I was talking about digital marketing, when the Vistage members, everybody looked at me like I had 3 heads. And what's happened over the last number of years is there's been greater adoption of digital marketing as a subset of AI, right? And now I would say most Vistage members, they may not have a marketing department, they may have a marketing coordinator, they might be outsourcing to digital, but almost everybody is looking for marketing automation because they know that that improves sales connectivity. The old paradigm was digital was all about lead generation. Now people are starting to come around. No, this improves the effectiveness of our salespeople. So just that marketing example of AI, there's much more adoption in small and mid-market companies. But I would even say in other types of companies, there's a lot of digital transformation that's happening right now on the operations side. You know, we have one of my clients is a large potato grower. You know, they're going to be putting sensors in the field and using autonomous tractors and gathering information from the field about the richness of the soil and all those kinds of things. So AI is going to help promote leveraging that information in a way that could be competitive advantage. So this is a great illustration on the shift of investment. So as I mentioned, there's a big shift away from hardware and, running, various kind of like internal IT functions to more creating applications which improve the customer experience. So there's vastly more investment on the software side than the hardware side. And I think the real implication for this for a lot of Vistage members is, they learned during the pandemic, we need to rethink how we're doing HR, and they've also had to rethink how they're doing IT. And that's not just the guy who could fix the copiers, right? That's a different type of technologist than maybe we were employing 5 years ago.
Marc, one of the areas that I have a lot of conversations with folks about is the current state of collaboration technology, right? The pandemic came, we snapped into hybrid, we worked from home, and all of a sudden we're on Teams, we're on Zoom, we're on Slack. What's the next wave when it comes to collaboration technologies? And how is that going to bridge the gap between someone like myself who's fully remote versus someone who's hybrid who can be in the office or not? Help us understand that flow.
Well, we only have 20 minutes left. I'm not sure that's enough time. So this would be my observation. This has been really painful. What happened around March 2020 is we sent everyone home and we told them, please be safe and learn Teams. And that didn't go well. And the problem was not with Teams, although I don't think it's the best technology, but we were expecting a behavioral change overnight, and people have been very slow to make that behavioral change. Teams is supposed to be a collaboration suite where you work in work threads and not on email. And you embed your work, when you do a video, you embed that video into your work thread. That's not how people are using Teams. They're using Teams as a place to store files and some other random things. Now, this is really, really exciting news, and I don't really know all the details, but I have heard a rumor that Microsoft will be having a new release of Outlook in March or April of this year, which will include threads embedded right in Outlook. So when I'm talking about threads, I'm talking about something like Slack, because that's really what collaboration is supposed to be. You have conversations online, not create email, find email address, attach file, send file, open file, delete file. That's 6, 7 steps instead of working in a thread, which is far more efficient. So I think that is going to be a big advance next year, and I'm really excited about it.
Yeah, Marc, you touched on this before, but can you go a little bit deeper into how AI as a service, but really AI on the marketing side, how someone can jump into that and what some of those immediate benefits might be?
Well, like I said, I think it's marketing automation. So what should happen in a contemporary sales and marketing organization in 2023 is they're collaborating, they're agreeing on their targets, they're creating a set of digital tools that help the salesperson before and after a sales call. That's very different than what marketing used to be, which was we went out there with our shotgun and we just spew marketing information to everybody. So one of the real benefits to, I'll just call it marketing automation, of which AI is a component, is it is allowing companies to be much more specific in their targeting, right? So I can send a different campaign to prospects and clients. I can send a different campaign based on the attributes of the client. So one of the ways that AI is going to get real interesting is 2 or 3 years from now, we're not going to have static web pages anymore. When a client comes to our website, we're going to say you're a commercial real estate agent. We're going to know what property do they already own? What is their credit score? Or what is their age? What is their sex? And we're going to create a custom landing page for that individual person. That is a whole different way of thinking about marketing than we've done it in the past.
Well, Mark, you leapfrog ahead, because what it suggests is that we know that buyer behavior changed. 78% of CEOs said buyer behavior changed as a result of the pandemic. This was a year ago. And then last year, 43% buyer behavior changed as a result of inflation. So we've got this changing buyer behavior, and we know that they've gone more digital. How do CEOs close that gap between where they are today and what they might have done, and this amazing future you described that's possible by taking some of these steps and moving further and more rapidly down that digital transformation path?
I'm saying that the opportunity is to identify the distinct needs of a more finite set of users and deliver value to them in their language, right? So, Joe, the way that I might market to someone of your age and sophistication and background and your geography and everything could be vastly different than someone else. So I think a lot of the advances in marketing are about being more finite with our targeting. So I'd probably have to keep it that broad.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So let's talk about ecology and social trends. One thing I'm really concerned about is I think that the housing affordability crisis is only going to get worse because, if you follow all the forecasters, they think there may be a marginal pullback in pricing next year, maybe 3% in terms of housing prices. But there is going to be less single family starts, less home new sales, less existing home sales, and really troubling, less multifamily starts. So that's your apartment buildings. If there is less inventory of those in urban areas, there is no relief for our renters, right? So, a lot of your employees who are just, say, above the minimum wage, they're kind of living at the poverty line. According to the banks, they can afford $694 a month, but the cost of housing is $1105 a month. It's 40% more. And what's the real pain point for employers is their employees can't live where they work. Their employees are having to commute 30, 40, 60 minutes to work. And a lot of them are saying, I might as well just work at McDonald's. So that is really, really a struggle.
That also contributes to inflation, because if we're constantly chasing this increased rent, increased mortgage prices, et cetera, that's going to continue to fuel that inflation fire, isn't it?
At a time that people can afford it the least. So again, this is the problem with averages. What can the average American afford? Well, we're not averages. We are people. And so there are people.
Fire and I'm sitting on a block of ice. On average, I'm okay.
Right. But I would say, certainly the bottom third or 40% of Americans they're struggling. And so whether you're a marketer to them or you're employing them, we really need to understand them, and housing affordability is one of those things. Another interesting thing I think is, if you're paying attention to everything that's going on in Europe, their big problem there is is energy. And here's one of the reasons why. The circles on the left are the places where oil comes from. The circles on the right is where oil is consumed. So what you'll see is Europe doesn't produce any oil, but it consumes a lot. So that's why when the war in Ukraine began, they were caught a little flat-footed with not enough energy sources. Interestingly enough, the North American countries we produce about what we consume. And this will be a shock to a lot of people, but you may not be aware, the US is by far the largest energy producer in the world. We generate a lot more energy than Saudi Arabia does. So this is going to be potentially a source of advantage for the US, that we have become somewhat energy dependent. That's the good news. Here's kind of the bad news. In the US, about a third of our energy comes from oil. About another third comes from natural gas, and the remainder is nuclear, coal, and renewables. Nuclear is very unpopular because people think it's unsafe. Coal is very unpopular because it's dirty. But the problem we have as a society is we are not able to create or adopt enough renewables fast enough to offset fossil fuels. So the United States and every other major country in the world has not proven capable of keeping up to the commitments that they made in the Paris Accords, which of course was the agreement that they reached to improve climate change. So the result of that is large-scale weather events, right? In 2022, in the US alone, we had 22 weather events that cost more than $1 billion. So what's going to happen in 23 and beyond? I don't think we're off to a very good start. I can tell you in California, the cyclone bomb has been a complete nightmare. I feel like it's rained for 20 days in a row. But my point is companies are...
Like I said, the other side of that coin is I'm in Connecticut and it's 54 degrees today.
Yeah, right.
In January.
But there's important business implications to this, because companies are actually starting to plan for weather events, which is not something, that they have ever done before. The other part of that is, our responsibility as employers as it relates to the environment is now under the auspices of what companies are referring to as ESG, which stands for environmental, social, and governance. I would say during the pandemic, what happened early in the pandemic, there was a lot of discussion about diversity, equity, inclusion. Now our language is changing and companies are folding that all into a broader definition of what they're calling ESG. Now, some people on the line are going to think this is just a big public company thing. And that was true 3 or 4 years ago. But what's happening now with a lot of Vistage members is they have customers who are public companies, and those companies are demanding that they report what their footprint is on all things ESG. But one of the things that's fascinating, I mentioned I work with a few potato growers. One of them has a large Fortune 100 customer who came to them and said, we want you to improve your ESG footprint. And my client said, by how much, where? And they're like, we don't know, you figure it out. So a lot of these public companies are saying, we want you to be more socially responsible, but they don't really have any metrics to decide what success looks like. The other thing is that this is becoming more and more important for employees, especially millennials. So your younger employees are going to pay attention to if you have ESG policies on your website. And then the other thing I would say is positions are being redefined. So what we used to call safety, a lot of companies are calling environmental safety, because now it's not just about accidents, it's about ensuring we don't have, we have a safe work environment as it relates to infectious disease and so on. So kind of a reframing about how we think about these things.
Well, you talk about ESG, and I'm connecting the dot now to the talent wars. I spoke with one of our members at one of our Vistage executive summits, whose business is installing solar panels. And his comment was, I have no trouble finding workers because so many of the millennials and the Gen Zs, they want to work for a company that's connected to an ESG premise. And obviously solar and renewable is one of those things. How do CEOs ingrain this into their business without doing a full, reverse shift change, but rather migrate into a more, I don't say compliant, but a more ESG friendly environment specifically to attract and retain people?
I think it depends on your mission and values. So it's really about having a set of mission and values and communicating those and setting expectations. You maybe have KPIs and that kind of thing to help ingrain your ESG policies as well. So I have some of those things in the action plan, which let me run through that. So what do you do with all this? Here are some things that I might recommend. This is a year to tighten but not cut bone, right? So again, we're talking about the difference between 3% GDP growth and 0. It's not the end of the world. So we don't want to be cutting away important talent or reducing our capability. I think you need to be prepared. In any downturn, you hoard cash, right? And I already mentioned the importance of pricing dynamically. If you're considering an exit, borrowing costs are very high right now, and they're going to be that way for at least 2 years. And if you're a buyer of everything that the Bolios are talking about, and you really think the world's going to come close to the end of 2030, which I kind of agree with where they're headed. That the national debt is really troubling. You probably have a window between 26 and 30 or so where you could probably get full value for your business. So you might start positioning in that way. I believe the world's going to split in two. There's going to be an East and a West. And China is going to fuel part of the world, and we're going to be the source for other parts of the world. So we really need to think about nearshoring and not having any single sources of failure in our supply chain, being able to be self-reliant. And like I mentioned, I think the new nuance to that is energy is one of those things that we really ought to be thinking about. So any way we can reduce our particular energy consumption and not be reliant on sources halfway around the world, I think is important. Speaking of ITR, I think you also need to have track external measures of demand. They're an excellent source for that. There are others. But in your KPIs, don't only think about what's going on inside your company. There might be external things that you track that might predict demand in the future. Find ways to embed AI and use them for mundane tasks. And like I said, I think marketing is one of the first canvases where we'll see that play out. Make sure you have a business continuity plan, and that can't just be, will the computers work, or do I have 2 servers? That has to be, if I have to physically shut down this office for 10 days, what will I do? And by the way, I hate to say this, people aren't going to like hearing it, but I had 2 or 3 clients with COVID outbreaks, like in the last 2 weeks. Yeah. As my good friend Joe Galvin says, the pandemic is over, but COVID's not over. So, be aware of that. And just make sure that, you have, if ESG is important to you, then, have those values and make sure you're communicating them. And then where I want to end off is with some specific ideas for employers, because I do think kind of game, set, and match right now, this is the one thing you must get right? So invest in employer branding. I still see client websites, no employer information at all, or they have a careers page that just lists the job. So this is the place for you to express your differentiation as an employer. I mentioned planning with a purpose, making sure if you people coming in the office have a reason for them to be there, and really think about if your real estate makes sense. Measure employee engagement formally. So that's usually at least a once a year survey. That's a deep dive, and maybe a pulse quarterly, just to see how people are doing. Your employee engagement and satisfaction and loyalty should actually be one of your KPIs. One of the things that we learned during the course of the pandemic is internal communications is more important than it's ever been. So people want to be clear in your vision and that type of thing. So make sure that you're communicating it and allowing them to see how they're connected to your corporate vision. Labor costs are going to be higher. I don't see any way around it. And if you set direct labor costs to be 3 or 4% higher this year than last year, I don't think that that's realistic. One big trend is that a lot of members who didn't have dedicated talent acquisition have added that recruiting function within their company because of the importance of recruiting. We already touched on the need to revisit our collaboration software, make sure that we're using it in a way that's highly productive. And you need to create a model where your employees are productive wherever they work. That's incumbent upon us as the employers to make sure they're productive. So that's making sure that they have the right technologies and tools and training and leadership, and we're communicating in a way that's suitable when people are working off-site. And then kind of the final thought I want to share before we open it up to questions, Joe, is, downturns and upturns are a natural way for the economy to rebalance supply and demand. So when supply and demand get out of whack, bad things happen. Crypto was a bubble, the bubble burst. It needed to correct. It has corrected, right? There will be other things like that. And as I know, as a lot of our business owners know, that is also a time ripe for opportunity, is when, we're in this time of unrest. So what I want to implore the members to do is not plan quarter to quarter. It's very important that you're looking around the bend, you're thinking about disruption that could change your industry forever. And that's why doing the trends analysis, being aware of trends external outside your company, is really important. So I want to leave you with one of my favorite quotes. The great John Wooden said, be quick, but don't be in a hurry. And that's how we ought to be thinking about the economy. So Joe, I'm happy to take any questions that we have.
Well, Marc, my goodness, you've covered so much ground today on so many disparate topics. I invite everyone who's listening to this to go to the Vistage Research Center, and we'll drop the link here into the chat function, and read your trend series, because you covered so many things today that are on top of that. And that's just such a great resource. And that's where one of the questions that I wanted to ask that also came from the group is, you cover so much ground, and you also mentioned earlier that the headlines are saying this and saying that. And we know that, headlines are about selling newspapers and, bringing us dirty laundry. The Eagles taught us that. What are your sources of information? Where are the places that you go to get information that's not bent, that's not biased? And, there's a variety of perspectives, but what are your trusted resources?
Yeah. Well, I love reading The Economist to stay on track of international trends. I like Kiplinger's. They have a lot of interesting trend information. And then, I read your Bloomberg Business Week and all of those kind of, standard periodicals. But the point I'm really making is the 6 o'clock news is meant for ninth grade education. They love to drop the most inflammatory story of the day is what leads the news. So you really can't leverage that for your information. You need to be reading all your trade periodicals and be active in your trade associations, be on the Vistage Research Center, be in your Vistage group, and just be intellectually curious and broaden your horizons on what you consume.
So Marc, we've just gone through this incredible era of volatility since, for the last, 3 years. Things seem to be flattening out. What are some of the key metrics that you're looking at to give you some indication about where and how this might evolve, whether we dip into recession, whether we just stay flat? What are the metrics that you look at that we can also kind of keep an eye on?
Well, it was one of my first slides. What I would be correlating is, as the Fed raises rates, what is direct impact on the unemployment rate and the number of jobs created and CPI? Because if those things don't come under control by, say, the second quarter, I think we're in for a really long road. I'm hopeful that they will. But, we don't know that monetary policy is going to work as it has in the past in this situation. I'm confident that it will, and we'll come out of this, but we do have to be really attentive to all of those things.
Well, Marc, we're coming to the end of our time together. I can't begin to thank you enough for the time you put in to prepare this, to your trends, and all the great work you do with Vistage members as a speaker. We just want to say thank you so much. It's such a privilege to have you on with us on the Peak series and to get a chance to listen and learn from you today. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Joe. We appreciate your leadership as well, and I hope everybody stays safe out there. Thank you.
Thank you. And for all of you that are listening here, be sure to join us this month for the next 3 can't miss webinars. 1, polish up on your HR strategy next Friday, January 20th, when Insperity Cheryl LaPlace presents Attracting and Retaining Talent, Remaining Competitive in a New Era, a topic we touched on today. Then our friends at ITR, my good friend Alan Bolio, returns to Vistage with a changing landscape, Calculate to Win. They recently changed their forecast based upon the Fed actions. And that's a can't miss event as well, just like this. A member exclusive, only members on Friday, January 27th. And then in another member exclusive, New York Times best-selling author Daniel Pink sits down with Ann Petrick, our VP of Research, to discuss the power of regret, resilient leadership, and some of the other great work that he's done. We're really excited about Daniel Pink and what he's going to share with our chairs at our upcoming Chair World, as well as a session for our members, because he really gets you to think about things in ways that you haven't before, much like you do, Marc. So again, Marc, thank you so much, my friend. Greatly appreciate your time. You can register for these sessions now at vistage.com/webinar. That's vistage.com/webinar. No S at the end of that. And I'd like to thank everyone for your time and attention. Please be safe, and let's look forward to having a really strong and positive 2023. I'm Joe Galvin.
Thank you, Joe.
Thank you, Mark. Joe Galvin, Chief Research Officer at Vistage. Thank you for your time.